If you're familiar with my work, you'll know that I absolutely love shooting with backlight. It's really part of my signature style. The one thing with shooting with backlight is because you're shooting towards a light source, you might end up with blown out bokeh in the background. Now, as long as it's not directly behind the subject, it doesn't usually bother me too much. But there is a method in Photoshop you can use to drastically improve the look of the bokeh. It's quick, it's easy, and I'm going to show you how right now. Hi, my name is Charlotte Reeves. I'm from Unleashed Education, and you've tuned into another editing toolbox video where we share one quick tip, trick, or technique to make your pet photography editing life easier. So in this episode, we're going to take a look at improving the look of blown out bokeh in the background of backlit images. So this is a fairly typical backlit image here. I've chosen an angle to make sure there's no blown out bokeh directly behind the subject. However, there is still some in the background. It was kind of unavoidable. Now, a little bit of blown out bokeh doesn't bother me too much as long as it's not taking up a really large part of the image. The reason why some people might see it as undesirable is these areas of blown out highlights in the background have no detail in them. They're basically completely white. Now, if you just take the exposure of those highlight areas down, it's going to give it a really grey kind of look. Instead, we're going to put a little bit of colour in there. So first up, you'll want to create a solid colour layer. So over in the layers palette here, solid colour. Now it's just come up as white to start with, so I'm just going to say okay, and then I'm going to turn that layer off and then double click on the colour here to bring up the colour picker. Now, if we zoom into this area here, there are some areas of bokeh that do have a little bit of color. And so I'm basically just going to sample from there. And that's chosen this really, really pale sort of orangey yellow kind of color. And that's the sort of color that we want to use. So let's go okay. I'm going to turn that layer back on again and see how that's filled up this area. So we need to use a mask to restrict that to only the areas that are blown out. So I'm going to select the mask on that layer and just invert the color. So Command I on the keyboard changes it to a black mask, basically hides all of that color. Now the magic really comes into play when we choose a different blending mode. So we can't just put a solid color over those areas because it's going to completely obliterate any detail in those areas that's already existing. So instead, I'm going to change the blending mode to multiply. I'm going to zoom into these areas here. I'm going to grab a brush. So it needs to be a white brush. Press B on the keyboard to switch to a brush. I'm going to make sure I'm on that mask layer. And I'm just going to paint inside these areas here. Now, it doesn't matter if I go over the edges a little bit because it's not a solid color, it's actually blending. It's still keeping the detail that is in those areas. So all the way over here and here. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. So let's just turn that layer off and on again. Now see, it's actually put a little bit of color in there. Now the color that you initially chose might be a little bit much. It might be a bit too dark. Remember, we don't want to go too dark because it is essentially a highlight, so it's meant to look bright. So let's just select that layer and then just take the opacity down a little bit. And I think for this, I'm going to take the opacity down to about 50%. So I think that's enough to just put a little bit of extra color in there, but have it still look nice and realistic. And I think that's really improved the look of the image. So hopefully that tip will help you whenever you have blown out bokeh in the background of your backlit images. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below, and I'll see you next time for Editing Toolbox. Catch you later.